Welcome aboard the Romancing the Gothic airship, Ghosts and Ghouls. I'm Dr. Caroline Duvezin, and I will be your pilot for the next 2 hours. Please be aware that along our journey, we will encounter topics and images that might be triggering for some passengers. Abusive relationships, sexual assault, rape, mass death, and instances of grievous bodily harm, including foot binding and mutilation. I will warn you ahead of time in each instance and then gesture like this when the danger has passed. And of course, the content warnings will also be relayed by my co-pilot, Dr. Sam Hurst, via this communication device known as chat. The exit to the meeting is situated at the bottom right of your screen. In case of technical Zoom difficulties, please remain calm and make sure to secure your own goggles before assisting any other passengers. In case of technical airship difficulties, feel free to panic because there's really nothing we can do. These things are not safe. 3 pit stops, aka question times, are planned along the way, one after the end of the first 2 of 3 parts, and a final one after the conclusion. In the name of Sam and myself, and not really anybody else because this is a bit, there's no sponsor, I wish you a pleasant journey. Okay, so first things first, what is steampunk? So there's like among the number of the pithy definitions you can find on the interwebs, there's one which I think will speak to this group in particular, which is that steampunk is what happens when goths discover brown. A quote which has been attributed to Neil Gaiman, which was certainly popularized by Sherry Priest, but she seems to have originated with Jess Nevins. Another one which is floating around is that steampunk is Victorian science fiction by J.D. Foxen. And this one specifically is incorrect. So steampunk as a genre is something which starts in the late 1970s with a group of 3 young Californian writers, sometimes referred to as the Californian Trinity, K.W. Jeder, James P. Baylock, and Tim Powers, who were just writing speculative fiction and hanging around with Philip K. Dick, as you did at the time. And they were contacted by an editor, Roger Elwood, with the project of publishing a series of novels which would feature King Arthur reincarnating throughout the centuries to save England. And Jeder started out doing a lot of research and became particularly obsessed with London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew as a historical source. And he wrote the novel known as Morlock Night as a sequel to The Time Machine. Of course, as these things I want to do, the project fell through, but Jeder did find an editor, so the novel did come out in 1979. And the whole idea is that the protagonist, Edwin Hawker, is part of the anonymous audience listening to the original time traveler's story. And then after he comes out, he is accosted by an old man who's like, oh, mission for you, gotta save the world, you know, usual. And then poof, magic sends him back in time. And the old man is, of course, Merlin. And it turns out that he is sent to a version of 1892 where the Morlocks have stolen the time machine and have, you know, created havoc in London. And he has to find King Arthur so he can save the world. Spoiler, it turns out that the protagonist is, of course, the reincarnated King Arthur. Good job, you found him. The world is saved. Second novel to come out is Tim Powers' The Anubis Gates, which is by far my favorite of the 3. This one takes place in 1810, and the plot of the book is that the protagonist, Brendan Doyle, is an academic specializing in romantic and pre-romantic poetry, including Coleridge and Wordsworth, and also an obscure, actually fictional poet called William Ashbless. And he gets hired by an eccentric billionaire who's discovered a way to time travel to specific points in time and decides that, of course, the best way to use that is to have paid guided tours to specific points in history. And in this particular case, he wants to go to a lecture by Coleridge in London 1810, and he needs an academic to do the spiel about what the romantics are of this. So they do that. And then through a series of things, Doyle becomes stuck in 1810. Along the way, you get Lord Byron, who is kidnapped, cloned, and brainwashed into trying to assassinate the monarch of the United Kingdom, which is the worst, but not the last thing which happens to him in a steampunk novel. Apparently, Byron has one of these phases where in steampunk, something bad just happens to him. I don't know. And along the way, with the help of a body swapping werewolf, long story, Doyle actually becomes the poet he was studying. He becomes William Ashbest. So you've got this very meta dimension to the novel, and also a crazy clown on stilts and like all sorts of weird things, but mostly the meta thing, which is really cool. And then the last of the trilogy to be published is James T Baylock, even though he published a short story ahead of Morlock Night, the 8-box affair, which is about an orangutan landing and people think it's an alien. Sure. And Homunculus is, once again, completely crazy. Starts off with a skeleton piloting an airship in the sky of London, and you've got a cult, some zombies, some fish, which can make you immortal, you know, normal stuff. KW Ujeta later publishes the Infernal Devices, which is a bit more well-known than Morlock Night. But for our purposes, what he also does in 1987 is send a letter to Locus magazine, which goes as follows. Dear Locus, enclosed is a copy of my 1979 novel Morlock Night. I'd appreciate you being so good as to root it to Farren as it's a prime piece of evidence in the great debate as to who in the Powers Blaylock Jedi fantasy triumvirate was writing in the Gonzo historical manner first. Though of course I find her review in the Marsh Locus to be quite flattering. Personally, I think Victorian fantasies are going to be the next big thing, as long as we can come up with a fitting collective term for Powers, Blaylock, and myself. Something based on the appropriate technology of the era, like steampunks, perhaps. So the way the term is first coined, it's mostly a joke, riffing off of the most popular form of speculative fiction, which is, of course, cyberpunk. And where it gets confusing is that one of the most famous steampunk novel is also written by two cyberpunks, William Gibson and Bruce Sterling. So that's The Difference Engine, which comes out in 1990. And in it, they imagine that Babbage's Difference Engine, when there was a prototype built in 1832, was actually mass-produced at the time. And we know that Ada Lovelace, Byron's daughter, created the code for that, for the first proto-computer. So what you get is a version of 1855, which is very different to the one we know, because you have the result of the Industrial Revolution, but also the revolution of communication kind of happening all at once. So I won't go into the plot too much, but it's important in the way that it establishes this tradition of alternative history in steampunk, which steampunk doesn't always do, but you know, because it's one of the more well-known ones. So 1832 being this idea of a point of divergence, where, for example, in the Men de High Castle, it's 1945. So the moment in time where fiction goes zag when the history went zig. Sounds weird when you say it like that. And you see the influence of the cyberpunk aesthetic of Gibson and Sterling's novel like in a novel like Whitechapel Gods by S.M. Peters, which came out in 2008. This is also a year where you get a steampunk anthology, kind of looking back on this whole first wave, including authors like Paul DiFilippo, who published the Steampunk trilogy in 1995. Also Michael Moorcock, whose trilogy Nomad of the Airstreams in the late 70s was later considered as maybe being a predecessor of steampunk, early steampunk, all of that. So sort of looking back, and the introduction is all about saying how this is proper steampunk. The kids nowadays, they don't know how to do it properly, because you know what steampunk is busy doing in 2008? It's busy going mainstream, you know, being featured in the New York Times, not at all respectable for counterculture or subculture. And then in 2009, we get what we call second wave steampunk, where we have 3 novels which come out in quick succession in the fall of 2009 and are hugely successful. The first one is Bone Shaker by Sherry Priest, which is set in Seattle and imagines that the Civil War is still ongoing in 1885, and also there are zombies, which are created by a sort of gas which corrodes everything and turns everything sepia, the color of sepia. And also, if you don't wear your goggles properly, the gas will get into your eyes and you'll become a zombie. So this is why you wear the goggles, not to become a zombie. Leviathan by Scott Westerfeld is set on the eve of World War I. One of the protagonists is the fictional son of the Archduke Ferdinand, and it has the coolest map I've ever seen in a fantasy book. So designed by Keith Townsend, along the lines of the allegorical maps which you got in 1914. So and you have the division of Europe between Clanker nations, which use actual technology, and Darwinist nations, which actually use bioengineered animals as sort of modes of transportation and weapons and all that good stuff. And then you have Solas, which is a series of 5 novels which starts out in London in the 1870s. And this one, again, uses the idea of a point of divergence plus the supernatural. In this particular case, the point of divergence is Henry VIII's breach with the church. And the whole idea that the author has is that this was over open acceptance of vampires and werewolves into society. The divorce thing was just a front. Suddenly, everything made sense. Cravats covered bite marks. The British regimental system is clearly based on werewolf pack dynamics, and pale complexions are in vogue because everyone wants to look like the trend-setting vampires. So, steampunk. Is it literature? Well, yes. Originally, if we go by when the term was coined, it was, first of all, books. But honestly, if I'm trying to explain to somebody what steampunk is, I'm not very likely to tell them, oh, go read the Difference Engines or go read the Anubis Gates. I'm much more likely to tell them, well, you know, you've seen it before. You know that kind of fashion. You've seen the kids' stolen pictures. You've seen objects which have been steampunked by creators like Jake von Slot. You know what it looks like already. It's seeped into the popular culture. And the result of that is that, according to Dr. Mike Persson, what steampunk is, if we want to have a unified theory, is most of all an aesthetic. And in his thesis, he says, I quote, "The aesthetic approach can be applied to literature, film, music, fashion, and art. It enables a view of discussing steampunk without being elitist exclusive or needlessly inclusive. This bothers some. They do not want their steampunk to be an empty aesthetic. From my perspective, the steampunk glass is not half full or half empty. It is empty, awaiting the artist to fill it with something. Want your steampunk to have more punk? Fill the aesthetic with your activism. Want your steampunk to have more steam? Make your aesthetic accurate. Just looking for a good time? Then add some absinthe to your aesthetic and let loose the dirigibles of war or exploration and head for the horizon." So his thesis was presented in 2012, and then more recently he also published the Steampunk FAQ, which I'm now using as my new Bible when it comes to steampunk. I also own the literal Steampunk Bible, but this one is mostly pretty, lots of pretty pictures. This one has all the good content. So I'm going to be quoting it a lot, and even when I'm not, just imagining that's all the background of what influenced what and what was important. So the central image with which the book starts, and also the thesis, is, of course, with the goggles. We always start with the goggles. So this idea that you have different lenses which you can slide into place to look at different elements of steampunk, and where they converge is where you find the genre emerging, be it in literature, anime, music, fashion, all of that. So one element is technofantasy, which he sums up very well as looks like science, works like magic. Retrofuturism, how we imagine the past, imagining the future. It's a little bit mind-bendy. And then hyper-vintage. So in the thesis, this is called neo-Victorian, retro-Victorian, later hyper-Victorian, but he keeps kind of expanding the notion because the term is used very loosely. So in the broadest definition, it's called yesteryear, it's also evocative of the pre-digital but post-Renaissance past in broad and fanciful ways. It's quite broad. And then there's this nucleus of the glass, which is the 19th century or Industrial Revolution, which is more of the privileged era in which it is set, even though it doesn't have to be set in the past at all. We also have futures and secondary worlds and all that. And he says that a purist would say that only the perfect storm in steampunk, but he likes to play in the gray areas, which they're brown in my reproduction of his Venn diagram because that felt more steampunk. I tend to also concentrate on like when the three cross, because my PhD was on neo-Victorian fantasy. So it included steampunk, but it was not my only focus. So I try to kind of distinguish the two a little bit. But I kind of agree with his idea that you don't need to have all three to count as steampunk in the way it can be understood. So to be clear, the fact that an aesthetic is conceived of as empty doesn't mean that it's meaningless, because it's not only what the creators put into the literature, the art, the fashion, it's also what the consumer, the critic, sees in them. And so there's one lens which, whether you wear it or not, gives you very different results when you're looking at steampunk. So if you're looking at Richard Castle wearing a steampunk outfit on the TV show Castle, yes, it is an homage to his role on Firefly, but if you have the post-colonial lens on, it's also, whoops, he's wearing a pith helmet. This is kind of problematic. And of course, making the pith helmet such an important element in Milovač's motivation for fighting Atlantis kind of shows you what the cartoon is really about. So Dr. Pershing's approach is to be descriptive rather than prescriptive, and trying not to be gatekeepery in any way, and not have this distinction between the fake steampunk and the real one. It is all steampunk, as long as it fits certain criteria, which I definitely agree with. But my approach is less about defining the genres, this has already been done, than giving you a kind of guided tour of the sites which I find interesting. And so I'm focusing on the techno fantasy element because it's nice and shiny, and humans are basically cats, you know, we like shiny things. And sometimes we also like to kind of push the shiny things off the table, see what happens, to look what's underneath. And sometimes there is nothing underneath, and that's fine. But sometimes there is something. So kind of, I agree with his overall thesis, but I'm kind of trying to do my own spin on the MT aesthetic, which is, you know, there's lots of debates in the steampunk community around that. All right. So first part, techno-fantasy, science, magic, and generic boundaries. So again, techno-fantasy looks like science, works like magic. Okay, but let's be a little bit more specific here. So if you're interested in speculative fiction at all, you know that the boundary between science fiction and fantasy is subject to debate. You ask, well, is it if it's set in the future or in the past? Is it when you have aliens or dragons, progressive or conservative politics? Is it, what do you do with examples which are on the borderline? What do you do with planetary romance, like what Anne McCaffrey writes? Why does Star Wars get to be science fiction, even though it clearly has knights and princesses in space? Sure, but they're mostly using magic, so what's the difference? What do you do with superheroes? Where do they fit in? And why the hell does time travel count as science fiction, even though it's become increasingly clear that we're never going to invent time travel, because otherwise somebody would have come back and fixed 2020 by now. So again, hotly debated a boundary between the two. An element which is sometimes used in the in-world justification of world building is, are they using science or are they using magic? And again, if you know speculative fiction, you've heard of Clarke's third law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, which works in many cases. I personally like to know whether I count it as science or magic within the world, because I'm an academic. I like taxonomies. I like putting things in boxes and then taking the boxes apart and writing articles about box making. It's just my thing. So you don't have to care about a distinction between the two. But if you do, I quite like Ted Chiang's definition. So he says, whoops, sorry. Roughly speaking, if you can mass produce it, it's science. And sorry, trying to slide the video. If you can't, it's magic. As an example, suppose someone says she can transform lead into gold. If we can assume her technique can use that technique to build factories that turn lead into gold by the ton, then she's made an incredible scientific discovery. If on the other hand, it's something that only she can do and only under special conditions, then she's a magician. And I don't mean that she's a charlatan. She might actually be able to transform lead into gold. But scientific phenomena are reproducible by other investigators. They aren't dependent on a specific person. Magic is, in a sense, evidence that the universe knows you're a person, which is a pretty cool idea. In my opinion. So one thing which you can do, however, when you're dealing with retrofuturism is that you have specific objects and disciplines which were considered science in the past, but are now have not been proved to be false. And one of these objects is ether, which, well, according to a deep dive on Wikipedia, it wasn't actually the fifth element according to Aristotle, but I just wanted to make the joke about the movie. So in a lot of physics until the theory of relativity, there was this idea that the heavens were filled with this kind of elastic gas without mass called ether, and that it was also what the soul was made of, but apparently that's also a different kind of ether. So I'm not a little bit fuzzy on the specifics. So something which was considered science and was then disproved later on, but still was very much considered true in the 19th century. One thing which steampunk also likes to do is take up fictional materials. So cavorite is something which was invented by H.G. Wells for the first Man in the Moon, which allowed him to kind of travel in space. And in later steampunk works, you see it being used as a source of energy. So steampunk is very meta in that way, turning the true things into fiction and the fictional things into truth within the world. Gail Carriger's books actually use plenty of steam, but they will rely on ether to make airship travel safe and stable and possible. And there's also some fart jokes because sure, why not while we're at it. So it's like a milieu that they travel in, but it also comes up again as the idea about the theory of the soul. So the reason for the title of the book is that the main character, Alexia, is considered soulless. So within this world, I had this theory that vampires and werewolves and ghosts, the reason they come back after death in specific circumstances is that they have an excess of soul, which binds them to this mortal plane. Whereas somebody like Alexia is soulless, which means that whenever she's touching a vampire or werewolf, they become temporarily human. And if she touches a ghost's body, she exorcises the ghost because the tie between the body and the spirit is broken. This allows the author to create this whole theory, which is basically about sociology and anthropology and how people fit together. There's this whole thing about ether ties binding a werewolf pack to their alpha and to each other, binding vampires to their hive and to the place in which they live, and binding the ghost to the body that is decaying. And social ties and also literal ties, like fashion is extremely important. The idea of boundaries and what is proper, what is improper is a freaking plot device in the book. Sorry. Yeah, so this means that this makes Solas and the Parcel Protectorate steampunk, but it's also often slotted into another category, which is manapunk. So for that, I will refer you to Megan de Brun-Mollet's essay, I Had No Idea Dragons Was the World Managed, Politeness Gets Political in Manapunk. It's on the internet. She has this definition which goes that ironically the punk is in the manners. Manapunk is punk not because its protagonists are isolated loners, but because they are able to use the system of manners to destabilize established hierarchies and become integrated members of a new and increasingly personal social order. So she also quotes Elsa Le Guin's rant about technology, which brings us to the distinction that we make between soft and hard science and how Le Guin's work is often considered soft science fiction. And Le Guin asked this question, well, why do certain things count as technology and not others? How people get and keep and cook food, how they clothe themselves, what their power sources are, what they build with, and what what they build with and what they build, their medicine, all of that is actually also technology. And I find it interesting that Jane Austen is kind of the titular author of Manapunk, even though I feel like if one author is really obsessed with clothing and food and how people travel and how long, it's really Georgia Taylor, so she should be the one that is getting punked. But you know, romance authors tend to be a little bit disregarded in the history of the genre. Nevertheless, the examples which are quoted by Megan de Bruyn-Mallet are Sword Point by Anne Kushner, the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik, and one which she does not quote, but which is definitely Manapunk, and is one of those instances where I've had to stretch to call it steampunk, but it is definitely Manapunk and does really interesting things with society. So this is the Glamorous Histories series by Mariam Net-Kowal. And so she starts with a very familiar premise with a Janian heroine called Jane, who has like problems like she's a spinster, she has to get married, all of that. Also, she lives in a world where there's magic. And as you move on in the series, the world becomes wider and stranger, and you realize that many things that you consider true within the boundaries of the world are actually the product of the way that Jane was raised, and also her colonial view on the world, until you get to book 5, where you have a subversion of the white savior narrative and a deconstruction of the whole magic system, where you discover that many things which were considered true are actually the product of Jane's own preconception, and everything falls apart, and it's extremely cool. And I wish that, honestly, more steampunk took this route of starting in a familiar Jane Austen-esque or Dickensian context, and then bringing us further and further and deconstructing that. Another term which is sometimes used concurrently to steampunk is Gaslamp Fantasy, a term which was originally coined by Kaja Foglio for her and her husband's webcomic, Girl Genius. And she says that she wanted another term because they had no punk and they had more than just steam. But really, that's the case with most steampunk. It's just the term itself is kind of misleading. And it's also interesting that this webcomic is called Girl Genius because, as Dr. Mike Bertrand points out, there are lots and lots of girl geniuses within steampunk, much more than boys. Wonder why. And one of them is the one who says the very weird quote, which I use for my title. So that's Geneviève Le Fou, who is a hat maker, a dandy, a lesbian. She keeps flirting with Alexia throughout the whole series of books. And she is also a mad scientist. And after the Parcel Protectorate, Carragher also wrote a prequel series called Finishing School, which is set in a finishing school where they're actually teaching young ladies how to kill people, which is much more cool than how to use, oyster fork or whatever. And it's set in this dirigible, so it's a floating school. And in it, Geneviève Le Fou is not yet this suave mad scientist. She's a very scruffy urchin. She's the niece of one of the teachers, and she spends all her time sneaking into the engine room and watching, how it all works and being fascinated by things. And so this is one instance in the novel where they're activating a cloaking device so that the school will be cloaked in fog as they travel closer to London. And it goes like this. The contraption was hooked up to boilers and attached to a complex series of metal tubes, springs, and gears, the range of which charm Vive. Oh my goodness, is that an electrosplit goopslimer port? I do believe it is. And is that a fresh-bottom pigmonger swizzle sprocket? Oh, swizzle sprockets. Vive was practically squeaking in excitement, and my voice did kind of the same thing. So it's one instance where you're like, okay, like this dialogue, these are not actually words, they're just a collection of sounds which are funny. And Carragher acknowledges that this was her own way of paying homage to the kind of technobabble which you get on shows like Star Trek. So Star Trek is also guilty of basically being fantasy disguised as science fiction. But the thing with steampunk in that instance is that it doesn't try very hard to disguise itself as science when it does its technobabble magic thing. So is steampunk science fiction or fantasy? The answer is yes. And to quote the late and great Terry Pratchett, science fiction is fantasy with bolts painted on outside. And we have now come to our first pit stop along the way.
Thank you. So if you would like to ask a question, you can ask a question in the chat, or if you don't mind being on the video, you can ask a question by video as well, if anyone would like to at this stage.
How to use an oyster fork to kill people. Yes, I would also like to know how to. Sorry.
No, okay. Sorry, I thought that was somebody asking a question, but it was just Cara, I think. Anybody got any at the moment? No? I've already asked mine this morning.
I know.
Julie's got a question in the chat.
Are most of the writers we've discussed American? Yes. And I will come back to that. Is kind of the point in my last part. It's you get a little bit from both, but it's mostly an American thing, and discussing that later on. But it's a very good question.
Could you give some examples of books that for you, maybe the ones that you've already used, but I'm thinking about that Venn diagram. So yeah. Books that kind of don't fit in that center part, or books that do, and why. Could you just kind of exemplify how those things could fit together separately for me?
I'm blanking right now, of course.
Don't worry.
I mean, the Glamorous Histories is definitely an element where it's not really techno-fantasy, it's very straight magic. So it's kind of more twisting it to the side. Yeah. There's some of them, for example, the Iron Dragon's Daughter, which is by Michael Swanwick, came out in the 90s. It's a very, very, very weird book. And this one, I don't even know if I would call it hyper vintage. It's just very weird. You start out as in a sort of 19th century-ish factory, but then by the end, it's sort of a high school drama, very much sword and sorcery. Like, it's not very, it doesn't really fit necessarily with a 19th century setting, like, at all, basically. But you definitely have the techno-fantasy because you have like a literal dragon, which is also a machine. And you have some retrofuturism, a little bit, but it's kind of a mixed match. So you have a lot of odd ducks in the first wave of steampunk, and still nowadays, I think, but it's become a little bit more unified. Otherwise, there are some quoted in Dr. Pershing's book. I know that for a fact, but I can't come up with one right now. So I'll check afterwards, if you don't mind. That's a good question.
I mean, I think maybe this is something you'll address later, but the idea of kind of it's becoming more homogenous, not homogenous, but becoming more defined. Is that something that is a statement that kind of maps the reality of it, or a statement that maps the perception of it, if that makes sense?
Hard to say, really. I mean, logically, there's been more of a marketing identity developed over time where people recognize steampunk a little bit better, so they have certain expectation about what it is. But basically, from its beginning to nowadays, that people say, oh, steampunk is this and steampunk is not that. And if you look at it as a scholar, you're like, no, you're wrong. There are counterexamples to everything you say. This whole thing in Victorian science fiction. It's hard to define it in a clear way because it is actually lots of different things looped together. But as my PhD subject, Neo-Victorian fantasy, is much more ramshackle. It doesn't really have a marketing identity when steampunk does, because it has this aesthetic that people recognize. So like it's like the big successes have become a little bit more unified and recognizable, but in many other ways, steampunk has also evolved in new and more interesting directions. So yeah, it's not actually that homogenized if you really look at it.
Cool, thank you. I don't know if anyone else has a question that they'd like to ask before we go on to the next bit. Oh.
Can you have steampunk elements within text without it being marketed as a steampunk narrative? Is it a genre? Yeah, for sure. Like, it's steampunk if you call it steampunk, but there's also, like, it's not like steampunks have like the monopoly on goggles and gears and using certain types of technology. And you have certain authors and also other creators, like especially for the music section. So this isn't really my area, but there are some music groups which were told by their fans, oh, what you're doing is steampunk. And then they looked at it and went, oh, I guess it kind of is. And then some of them tried to play into it a little bit more, adding to the fashion, adding specific elements to their music and all of that. But yeah, you definitely can. And even the marketing itself, like, yeah, it really depends. But if you look at the authors who are really successful, somebody like Gail Carriger, like, she's playing the whole game. She has all these blog posts about steampunk fashion, about different corsets that she owns and where they came from. So she is doing the whole steampunk spiel. Not all authors do that, and not all of them need to do that, for sure.
Thank you.
Unlacing is the best corset aesthetically. Is that a kind of corset or a way of doing it up? You'll see that at the end, maybe. Way of doing it up. Okay, well, it's good to know. I mean, I know Carriger has this blog post about how to choose a corset and how to do it up properly so that you're not actually being smothered all the time. So it's complicated. Yeah, so I hear. I do not actually own a corset. I have a friend who owns one, but I'm like, I would like a vest, please. But that's really hard to find in just the one steampunk boutique I know in Paris, because it's all very gendered. I think I own 8 corsets now. Wow, Julia. Wow, super impressed. Yeah, aesthetically lovely visually. But it doesn't always translate into comfort, does it? Ooh.
4 for the price of 1.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Vest. I'll get a vest at some point.
Okay.
Shall we? Because the second part is longer and it has lots and lots of things. So you're going to want to brace yourselves.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to need my typing fingers.
Yes, it has most of the content warnings. So shall I share again? Okay, so part 2, punking history, restoring reality, divergence points, DUI tech, and gender. So I want to start out with a different book series from the one I mentioned up to now, which is Mark Hoder's Burton and Swinburne series, starting out with The Strange Affair of Springfield Jack, published in 2010. The story goes as follows, if you go to the general structure. So here I need a content warning for sexual assault. So if you're not aware, Springfield Jack was a Victorian boogeyman, sort of folkloric figure who appeared out of nowhere and then disappeared, and lots of theories about who or what he really was. Started out in the 1830s, then went on into the 1870s, up to 1904, depending on what sources you're looking for. And most of his shtick was jumping out of nowhere and and sexually assaulting women, trying to kiss them forcibly and tearing their clothes. So this is what he did, and he is the villain in this book. Content warning over for now. And then the heroes are Richard Burton and Algernon Swinburne. So I'm sure you've heard of Burton before, a Victorian explorer. He's known for looking for the source of the Nile and getting into a bit of a fight with another explorer about it. He translated and published the Kama Sutra in English. He disguised himself as a pilgrim to go to Mecca, which is, he is in problematic figures in different ways. And then Algernon Swinburne was a poet, decadent one, a masochist. This actually plays a part in the plot. And according to Wikipedia, had a crush on Burton. And I'm sorry to tell you that there's a missed opportunity that in the book series, they never get together. They are strictly best friends fighting evils. And it's pretty cool, but really missed opportunity for sure. These are not queer books, as far as I can remember. There were also, historically, Burton and Swinburne, both members of the Cannibal Club, which is very relevant to this group's interest. And so the book is set in 1861, and it starts out, not exactly, but close to the beginning of the story. Richard Burton, who's just walking along, minding his own business, gets attacked by a strange figure, kind of jumps out and tells him weird things. And the way he later recounts the story goes as follows. "What the blazes is that thing, Captain Burton?" asked Trouts, that's the constable. "A man of that I'm certain," responded the famous explorer. "And a madman at that. He spoke nonsense, said I was a Victorian." "What's that?" "Haven't the vaguest idea, for it's fair to assume it has something to do with the late Queen. He said that if we stop him doing what he needs to do, everything will stay this way. And what he needs to do is restore." "Restore what?" "Myself, you, everything, whatever that means." Then he mentioned talking orangutans and said he had to charge it something again. So it's all very confusing to Burton, one can imagine. But as a reader, you're mostly going, what? The late Queen? What the hell is going on? So this is 1861, but not the version that you know. You've got giant bioengineered animals walking in the streets. The prime minister got a facelift. Burton should not yet have his knighthood. And also, oh, Queen Victoria has been dead for 20 years. So the way this is explained is that historically, in 1840, there was an attempt on Queen Victoria's life, as she was a few months pregnant, but by one man called Edward Oxford. And he failed. He was then declared mentally ill, sent to an asylum, later sent to Australia, where he passed the end of his life, and married a widow with 2 children. And then this book goes with that story and imagines a distant descendant of Edward Oxford. So imagines that he is actually who ends up being a time traveler. Content warning here for rape. It's not on the slide, plot details. So John Edward Oxford, who is a distant descendant of Edward Oxford, is born in the 22nd century. And when his story starts out, he's just discovered a clean and sustainable source of energy, which is going to change everything. And he's being very famous, getting lots of money, everything is good. He's also discovered how to use this source of energy to time travel. And he creates this weird suit, including stilts, because when you time travel, you're changing time but not space, so you don't know what else might be in the space you might occupy. So if you're elevated on stilts, there's less chance of you colluding with something, hence the Springfield Jack attire. And he goes, I've invented time travel. What should I do? Well, the best thing I can do clearly is go back in time and stop my ancestor from trying to kill Queen Victoria, because really it's not good for the family name. Should be easy. I'll be back by dinner. He's speaking to his wife, who is pregnant at the moment he leaves. So he does that and he goes. Of course it doesn't work. And what she actually ends up doing is making the assassination attempt successful. And he goes, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Well, that's fine, I can just fix it. So he goes back a little bit earlier in time and tries to stop himself from stopping his ancestor, etc. And at some point during this whole I'm trying to fix it, he ends up killing his ancestor. And he goes, whoops, okay, this is a problem. Do I now not exist? What happens to my wife and child? And he has this knowledge of family history, which is that the woman who Edward Oxford ended up marrying in Australia was actually the daughter of an old friend of his, part of this group called Young England. And he also knows that in their family, most women have a birthmark on their body, which he knows what it looks like on his mother. And he goes, well, clearly the best thing I can do is track down these old friends of Edward Oxford's, find their daughters, who should be young servant girls in London at the time in 1861, and just run around, tear off their clothes, and when I find my female ancestor, rape her, so I can create the child that was meant to be created by my ancestor whom I killed. This is his way of fixing it. And of course it goes horribly wrong, and he keeps going back to different time zones and messing it up. And Burton tries to stop him, so then he goes back in time to try to stop Burton from stopping him, which ends up spurring Burton on in trying to stop him. It doesn't work. End of content warning. So the irony of the whole thing is that with the emphasis that he puts on the idea of restoring things, the more he tries to do that, the more he actually ends up destroying reality and everything he loves. And there's this notion in the concept of nostalgia as explained by Svetlana Boym in her 2001 book, which is this idea of reflective versus restorative nostalgia. And this idea that restorative nostalgia stresses nostos and attempts a historical reconstruction of the lost home, which is interesting for John Edward Oxford because he's trying to go back to his wife and unborn child. And restorative nostalgia protects the absolute truth, while reflective nostalgia calls it into doubt. So the idea of the truth, historical truth, being centered on him as white male cishet character and villain ends up messing everything up, and is perfectly okay with sacrificing all of history for himself. And the thing is, by the end of the book, they've dealt with him, Burton and Swinburne have, but the damage he's done to time keeps reverberating, and things keep being slightly out of whack. World War War happens, but also it doesn't happen. At some point in the possible futures, Swinburne is a giant walking, talking plant, just, saying poetry as plants do. And also another version of Swinburne discovers that the sap is made out of whiskey, which Swinburne, the human, finds amazing. This is one of the crazy things which happen in the book. There's lots of doubles everywhere. It's crazy. So again, this whole idea of the more you try to restore, fix things, the worse it's gonna get. That's kind of the rule of time travel. But one thing which you can have in steampunk is the idea of restoring, not to fix things for your own ego and messing it up for everything else, but being able to address the wrongs of history and trying to face up and help with the pain that was caused. That's one thing which steampunk manages to do in different ways than in this book. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that. So in the latest wrongs, actually 2007, in the first issue of Steampunk magazine, which has this big project about putting the punk back into steampunk, you see that the cover is an image which is very familiar to us. So a female automaton being taken apart, fixed by an inventor. We have this image, especially in science fiction, through female robots and automatons, of the female body as an aesthetic object to be seen, admired, fixed, molded by male action. Something which gets subverted, for example, in the movie Ex Machina. And you see the same kind of object versus subject thing being used at the beginning of Justin Bieber's Santa Claus is Coming to Town music video, where it starts out with him winding up this doll marionette girl with like the key in the back. So that's how the music video starts. And this linking of robots with issues of female liberty and emancipation is something which is used in a novel I'm going to talk about now. And content warning here for the equivalent of sexual assault and abusive relationships. And it's a little bit in the quote, but yeah. So the novel in question is The Alchemy of Stone by Ekaterina Sedia, which is Russian steampunk. And the main character is Maddie. She is an automaton who has been emancipated by a creator and works as an alchemist. This whole plot, including revolution is brewing in the city she lives in. She's trying to work for the gargoyles of the city, hence the alchemy of stone, all of that. And the thing is that her creator, Lowari, emancipated her when she asked for it, but one thing which she refused to do was give her back her key. And she needs her key to live because she's made out of mechanical parts, she regularly winds down and needs to be wound up again so that she can just function. But he says that if he gives her a key, then she'll have no incentive to visit him and he'll be, you know, alone and sad. And how dare she leave him be that? Does she not love him? Is he not her creator? All of that. And one instance in the novel is when she goes with him to a party because of plot reasons, and she ends up winding down in the middle of the party, and then he just winds her up in front of everybody. And when she comes to, we have this reaction. She should be grateful for that, she thought, but instead she felt hurt, violated. He exposed her heart for all to see. He wound her up with the key around his neck, right in front of his friends. And one of the reasons why this is conceived as metaphorical violation is also because in the way that he designed her, he decided that winding her up would create pleasure for her as a kind of positive reinforcement so that she would ask to be wound up and things like that. And the more you progress through the novel, the more you realize what a messed up relationship Lowari has created with Maddie, and how he's trying to control her as much as he can, and he is metaphorically and literally messing with both her body and her head. It's pretty disgusting. So end of content warning for this. And along the way, Maddie meets a number of people who say that they understand why she wants to have her key back, especially women of color, but still by the end of it, she does not get her key back. And it seems like nobody can really understand the particular kind of oppression that she is under. And the ending is very sad. It's a very beautiful novel, but it is not uplifting, believe me. As Sam would say, it's Russian. So this is one example of a sad automaton. So let me give you some examples which are a little bit happier. So in the short story I'm going to present to you, the protagonist is Janara Begum, who historically was the daughter of the Shah who built the Taj Mahal for his dead wife, whom he loved very much. And she died historically in 1681. But in the short story entitled The Padishah Begum's Reflections by Shweta Narayan, the author imagines that instead she survives all her family by centuries because after nearly dying in a fire, her consciousness is transported into an automaton body, which doesn't age. And the result of that is that the Mughal Empire still exists in the early 1800s and is still very much a power to be reckoned with. And you have in particular a subversion of the idea of the female automaton as something to be looked at, because it starts out with Janara hiding in the shadows of her throne, and the French ambassadors, all the colonizers, approaching and not seeing her. So this idea again of sight as a way of establishing control, and they're being distracted by all the shiny things, because again, humans are cats. So there's the whole thing, like the story itself is built around a story being retold in different instances. It's extremely meta. I'm not going to spoil it, but basically it has to do with double identities and gender and people masquerading as other people, especially the double figure of the deity Narayana. What you get by the end is that you have this French ambassador who is waiting for the story to continue, basically because he wants to get something out of it and is getting impatient. But all along, what the Empress is really doing is trying to court somebody which he took with him at her request, who is Madeleine Vaucasson, who is an engineer and a weaver, and they've been corresponding for years, unbeknownst to everybody else. And the Venetia tells her, your ambassador arrives to hear the end of a tale he thinks told for him. She loved a little glance at Maîtresse Vaucasson, in total ignorance of the fact that the garden he meets us in is named for you. So instead of giving the woman she loves a tomb, she gives her a garden, which I think is actually much more romantic, if you want to compare. Another instance of this automaton, female automaton being used to kind of talk about female identity and liberty is, and here I have a content warning for very violent mass deaths and body horror. So it's in the story Working Women by Olivia Ho, published as part of the anthology The Sea is Ours, and takes place in Singapore in the 19th century. And you have one of the characters is Ning Lam. She is a cyborg headhunter who is hired to recover a runaway hybrid creature which has run away from her British masters. And this individual calls herself Ah Hong. She's a very strong, strange-looking woman, and she ends up being rescued by a toy maker called Kaironisa Al-Jazari, who is also a very good engineer and helps fixing her. And what you discover through a series of traumatic flashbacks is that Ah Hong actually comes from a group of Samsui women. So historically a group which emigrated to Malaya and Singapore in 1920s, but he gets pushed back in time to the 19th century. And there was an accident at the factory coal field where they worked in. Lots of people died, and the British overseers ended up actually piecing together a single person out of the different body parts and also out of the different minds. So Ah Hong ends up having all these memories of different women because she is all these different women, all this pain and suffering in one body and in one mind. And it's pretty fucking horrifying. End of content warning. What you get in the story is that once they discover her story, both Ning Lam and Kaironisa decide to help her free herself from the people who are trying to consider her as the property. And one important element which Kaironisa does and which Lohari, Maddie's creator, didn't do is ask for consent when fixing her mechanically. So this is the quote. She thought about it. If somebody has to open me up, better it's you, but I don't like it. I won't fix you unless I have to, said Kaironisa, getting up. I'll have to open your sternum to load some coal in, but that won't be for a while, and anyway, I can teach you so you can do it yourself. Thank you, she said. Thank you, Nisa, for this. So the simple fact of asking for consent before dealing with another's body. And so, like, Ning Lam and Ah Hong are literally cyborg women in their bodies, but really the cyborg elements, in the way that I understand Haraway, which is not very far to be quite honest, is in the cooperation between these different women and the communication between them, which allows them to free themselves from the society that wants to control them. And Kaironisa is also an example of the girl geniuses which we had in steampunk. Let me give you a few more examples of that. So one of them is the heroine of A Dead in Cairo by Fenison Jelly Clark, whose name is Fatma El Sharawi, and she is, so the story is set in an alternate history version of Egypt in 1912, where in the world building, and you learn that in the story, around 1868, 1869, an interdimensional portal just appeared out of nowhere, and a bunch of jinn and demons and angels came out, and they went, colonizers, don't like them, yeet. So Egypt has been free from British rule for 40 years, and there's very different versions of 1912, where the main character is a paranormal investigator investigating the dead jinn in Cairo, and she is a Muslim and a lesbian and a dandy and all around awesome. Another example of a girl genius is in the short story The Effluent Engine by Jemisin, and which was originally published in the same anthology as The Peninsula Becomes Reflection, so it's all about lesbians. And in this one, it focuses on Haiti after the revolution and of kind of creating a steampunk future which was more durably free of imperial influences and control. So the whole idea is that using the steampunk technology is that they were using the gases created during the fermentation of rum to fill hot air balloons and dirigibles. And what they're trying to do now to kind of retain their liberty is find a way to use the methane gas created during the fermentation also as a power source instead of coal or oil. And the main character, Gisèle Clairé, who is the natural daughter of Toussaint Louverture, one of the big figures of the revolution, goes to New Orleans to find an engineer to kind of perfect this first model which they have. And all sorts of things go awry, and she ends up losing the plans which she was originally going for. But what she ends up going back with to Haiti instead is Eugénie Hillieux, who is the sister of the male engineer she originally contracted for the plans. And this might also be, this is because the sister Eugénie is very brilliant, and also because Gisèle might be a little bit in love with her, and the story ends. Gisèle wondered why she had ever bothered with plans and papers and gadgetry, because it was clear she had just stolen the greatest prize of all. It's a very happily ever after. So what I like, particularly in this anthology and general, the idea of the girl genius presented is women of color being subjects of desire and being desired because of their bodies and because of their minds. And it's sort of really important way to drive the plot and also the world building. And then the last element I want to talk about in this part is the idea of technology used as for medical purposes in different ways. So in the next slide, I have a big content warning for images of people who are mutilated, and also the mention of genocide and mass deaths. Okay, so this is for the novel Everfair by Nisi Scholl, which premise is, as they say in the historical note, one of history's most notorious atrocities, King Leopold II's reign over the Congo Free State. The exact number of casualties is unknown, but conservative estimates admit that at least half of the populace disappeared in the period from 1895 to 1908. Millions of people died. And the images you see is the way that the Force Publique militia was trying to enforce order was mutilation on the slaves who didn't meet their quota or were rowdy in any way. And these pictures are important because they were used as a way to kind of rouse international outrage over what was happening, and this sort of helped bring an end to it. Not really, but they served the purpose. Okay, end of content warning for this one. So again, this is a alternate history version of this reality. So it starts out in 1895, where Nisi Scholl imagines that a group of Fabian socialists would use a big sum of money, which historically funded the London School of Economics, to instead, with some American missionaries, purchase a part of the Congo Free State from King Leopold II, with the goal of establishing a utopia, a country where slavery would not exist and all people would be equal. And they ended up doing that in cooperation with the rightful king of this region, King Wenda, and his awesome wife, King Josina, Queen Josina, sorry. And so the story plays out over several decades, and there's lots of evolution along the way. And one of the immigrants who comes to this new country to be free calls himself Tink and ends up developing a atomic energy, which is very useful in making Everfair a power to be reckoned with and allows them to free themselves from the clutches of Leopold II. But what he also develops along the way is a way to create steampunk prostheses, which replace the limbs which have been amputated. And in particular, you see a little girl called Fwendy, who is, when she starts out, a scared, recently freed slave, and then grows into being a spy and an actress. She has magic powers where she can project her consciousness into animals. So you see the very literal good that he does with this technology. And this is portrayed on the beautiful cover designed by Victor and Guy, where you see what I think are Fwendy's hands, so the flesh one and the metal one, holding the lamp that symbolizes the union of Everfair. And the colors show this kind of harmony that is possible. And again, like the prosthesis itself, it does not erase historical horrors, but it's a way to make the pain more bearable and to give back the bodily autonomy and the identity that was taken away by the horrors of slavery and imperialism. Another example of such medical technology, and here I have a content warning for images of foot binding in the next slide. So it's in Gunpowder Alchemy by Jenny Lin, which is one of the few examples of steampunk which actually deals with the opium wars and the opium trade. Kind of gets shunted aside a lot in steampunk. So it takes place in China during the Taiping Rebellion. So the main conflict isn't directly related to colonialism and imperialism, but is of course always in the background. And in particular, the mother of the heroine, Soling, is an opium addict. And we know whose fault it is that opium was introduced widely in China. And she has also this moment where she visits Shanghai, which was the British settlement, starting from 1845, and has this weird cognitive dissonance moment of saying, this is China, and yet it isn't China. So having the land being taken away from her. And along her travels, so she's traveling with her ex-fiance, this complicated Chang Wei, and she's a physician and he is an engineer. And they end up being captured by a group of bandits led by Lady Sue, who's based on a historical figure, who's an extremely badass woman. But the thing is that Lady Sue was part of the Han ethnic group, and so she practiced foot binding as a young girl, as part of a cultural background, and for her husband, who's dead when they encounter her. And as part of negotiating their release, Soling and Chang Wei negotiate and say, well, one thing which we can give you if you want is we could help you to walk again. Because Lady Sue is like an extremely badass leader, but she can no longer put weight on her feet and she needs to be carried around by some of the bandits. And they say, well, what if we could help you stand tall and walk by yourself? So what they end up designing is some steampunk boots, which work through acupuncture, which acupuncture needles connecting the feet with like the mechanics of the boots so that she can walk without putting any pressure on them. And it works, and they are released. And there's an excellent quote when Lady Sue is talking about the different kind of violences which exist, talking about Manchurian rebels who tried to free her and women like her by simply tearing away the bandages. And I quote, "Ignorant bastards thought our feet would simply regain their shape." So this book is has a very nuanced reflection of different kinds of violence and how relative they can be in a different context, to say it broadly. And again, an example of kind of a girl genius, to be quite honest, in Soling. And then the last example I want to use, so end of content warning, I'm taking away the picture now, is A Matter of Disagreement by E. Ottoman, which is a novella which came out in 2014. And so this is set in what the author calls a mechanical universe, which is steampunk universe, 18th century-ish, kind of a mix mash of different things. And the two main characters are Andrea and Gregory. It's sort of a rivals to lovers situation. And as part of getting to know one another, Gregory, the Marquis, tells this something which is part of the history of the nation, but also part of his personal story, which is that the Marquis is a transgender man, and that the way he was able to live as his true gender and not the one which was assigned at birth was by relying on a very old law which said that he could do that, so alluding to a court case which says, I'm sure everyone knows that part of my story. And then so old traditions, but then also new technology was made available to him as a way of having a gender-affirming surgery, should he so choose. So you've got this blend of tradition and modernity, and the idea of technology being used to help people be who they are and live in the body that they want to live in, basically. And E. Ottoman is a trans writer, a queer writer, and there's an interesting choice being made in the story where you do not have homophobia. And in fact, gay marriage is a perfectly normal and accepted thing, at least in this book. I haven't been able to get a hold of the two others in the trilogy because the tiny publisher went kaput in 2019, and I'm sure we'll get a hold of them eventually, but right now it's difficult. So there's no homophobia, but we do have an example of transphobia within the context of the novel. So what's interesting with Own Voices authors is the choices which are made in what to keep and what to erase as part of subverting certain expectations about what history should look like. Which brings us to the end of the second section and another question range.
Sorry. Hey everyone. Anyone got any questions? Feel free to pop them in the chat or to ask them more generally.
That is mostly content warnings.
I know. It's me speed typing content warnings out. No. I had a question that is slightly inspired by seeing Abraham here, actually. Is that, like, a lot of your examples have been from America or Asia and Africa, or based in those countries, and I wondered if there's an equivalent in Latin America, or if there's a steampunk, if there's a lot of steampunk that either comes out of Latin America or is set in Latin America.
I don't know of a specific anthology dealing with Latin American steampunk, but it's one example, at least. It's been a while since I read it, in The Sea Is Ours, because you have a lot of Filipino steampunk, which, as we know, the Philippines have a very complicated colonial history, different waves of colonization, and it's I think it's in the last Aswang where you get okay, let me recall. It's the Mayan ambassador coming to the Philippines and basically asking for advice in how to deal with those pesky Spanish colonizers. And part of that is basically cut them into pieces and eat them, because it's always the best answer, which is achieved through the help of the Manananggal, who is a Filipino vampire, which can cut itself into two pieces. One of them flies away. It's really cool. Normally in folklore, the vampire preys on babies, but instead in this version, it preys on colonizers, which is a much better diet, I approve. So that's one example I can think of. There are no others which come to mind right now. We do have, so not Spanish Empire, but Portuguese. Solarpunk started, the first Solarpunk anthology was actually edited in Brazil. So some of an offshoot of steampunk, which started out in a different context. I have not actually read any of the stories, so I don't know how differently they deal with colonial history, of technology, and all of that. So that's what I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, thank you. That's cool. Any other questions?
Does someone mention Copelia?
Yeah, this morning as well.
Yeah. I think definitely part of it. It's the whole imagery of female dolls, marionettes, robots kind of blends together, and there's definitely like different source, visual and literary sources kind of blended in the results which we see now.
I know that Hoffman was quite influential in the 19th century, so there might be sort of a particular trace there back in Russia. There might be a particular trace back to that in Russian literature, I don't know.
You mean for the Alchemy of Stone?
Yeah.
Definitely possible, yeah.
Because that's what it was in reference to both times, this morning and this afternoon. It was specifically the Alchemy of Stone.
Okay, that makes sense. It's hard to tell with steampunk sometimes if it's direct reference to 19th century things which were popular in the 19th century, or if it's through pop culture, things being filtered. Like, honestly, if you look at, Dr. Persson says this in his dissertation, if you look at the way that female automatons are dealt with, used as a way to talk about female emancipation and autonomy in steampunk books, it's pretty much the same thing as with robots in science fiction. Like, it doesn't have to be a specific allusion to this. But I think, like, yeah, because it's a Russian context, this might be a more specific way of rewriting this tale. Have to ask the author.
A challenge. Anyone else got any questions?
I do. I can't bother typing it. So I get the feeling, I don't know much about steampunk at all, but there must be some sort of gaps between those two words, right? And how wide the gap between steampunk maybe might mean how politicized it is. Maybe not in a novel kind of way, but maybe one way of thinking about it is more as an escape, and one possibly being more political, because some of the stuff you were talking about seemed really fantastic, and then some of it seemed really political. Does that make sense? I really know nothing about it.
The thing is, I'm a speculative fiction scholar, so generally I deal with books which are fantastic, and then I like to look at the politics in them. So I don't think things are not necessarily empathetical. I think maybe it's the whole idea of like something whimsy and silly versus like addressing serious issues, is I think what you're saying. Yeah, it's definitely a sort of central opposition which exists within steampunk, and the term itself, like honestly, the term itself is very misleading, in that people think that because it's steampunk, it has to be punk, otherwise it's not true steampunk, and that it is closer to cyberpunk than it was originally conceived of. Because again, like, and this is something which Dr. Mike Persson points out again, is that because Henry Mayhew was used as a source for the Californian Trinity, a lot of people think that there has to be a social element to rewriting the underclass and all of that. But if you actually read the novels, it's really not. There's like a little bit of like pleasure at depicting the underbelly, but it's really more as part of the whole Dickensian aesthetic, and also the whole, like, again, Americans looking at the British 19th century and going, oh, isn't this fun? Isn't this a fun place to have adventures? Well, yeah, it is, but mostly if you're white, male, cishet. So there is definitely this contradiction. And like within the umbrella of steampunk, you get all kinds of ways of dealing with that. And you certainly have some of them which are almost overtly, well, just overtly nostalgic. There's one series which I will not quote because I haven't read it, because Mike Persson talked about it in the dissertation. I went, nope, I'm not going to read that, which is very nostalgic of the British Empire specifically, which is, yeah, uncomfortable. Others are nostalgic in more subtle but still very disturbing ways. Generally, the use of Egypt, including in powers, not great, really not great in these books. And the thing is, because a lot of these stories are so fun and whimsical and crazy and have this fun technology, at first glance, like, oh, it's just fun adventures. Then you go, yeah, but still there's something under it. And just because it's not nostalgic doesn't mean it's true steampunk, because steampunk has come to encompass all the different political attitudes within it. But just because something is steampunk doesn't mean that it's interesting steampunk, is how I would approach it. I don't know. I got really burned out on steampunk written by white authors while we're doing the PhD, because there's lots of things which get repeated over time. And you're like, yeah, I've seen this before. And then you read something by authors of color and you're like, oh, I have not seen this before. This is actually much more interesting. I would like more of that, please. And you can have like fun hijinks while having also the political reflections, which I think Fennis and Jelly Clark's work is a good example of that. But yeah, it's subject to a lot of debate within the steampunk community for sure. You've hit somewhere on the head, a nail on the head here. Are you familiar with Diana Foe and her blog Victoriana? Yes, she is in the last part of the talk. I am. Yeah, she is one of the big voices of steampunk scene, talking about multicultural steampunk and non-Eurocentric retrofuturism. Yes, I am, and she is extremely important for sure.
She's a friend of mine if we ever want to try to get her to do a lecture.
Oh my God! I'm so jealous.
In my neighborhood in Brooklyn.
Yes.
She is extremely cool from what I've seen of her on Twitter, and
very
like
cool.
the books she edits are amazing. And
just drop that in there, Julia, lightly. Cool, and thank you, Abraham, for the link there. I'll have a look. That's awesome. A Mexican link, I can pop it up underneath the YouTube video if this is the one that goes up so people can find it.
oh yeah, okay, Mexican steampunk. That's pretty cool. I mean, if you go on the internet, there's a number of like abandoned vlog for different kinds of steampunk. So it doesn't always lead to something, but it's definitely something to look into.
Cool. Thank you very much. Shall we go on with the next part? Are you okay to do that, Karen?
Yeah, overheating a little bit. You know, steam technology, it's really not great. Not in summer anyway. Yes, shall continue on the last leg of this journey. All right, so part 3, power sources and difference engines, alternate futures, question mark. So a little bit of a change. I'm going to tell you a little bit about French steampunk. If this is a topic which you are interested in, which is in the final bibliography, which looks like this. So it's Tout le Steampunk by Etienne Barrier and Raphael Coulson, where it's mostly about English steampunk because that's where the movement really started. And for French steampunk, you get a few like early worms in the late 1990s, early 2000s, but doesn't really catch on until the second wave of steampunk in 2009. And if you look at this trilogy, Les Enchantements d'Entremer by Pierre Prévert, you'll notice that the first 2 books were published in the early 2000s, and then the last one was published in 2015, because the first two books kind of missed their target audience, and then after 2009, it was much more popular, so much more easy to have the third book published. So this trilogy is set in Paris during the Belle Époque, specifically in 1909, and which allows for a kind of a slightly different aesthetic, which you can see here is Art Nouveau aesthetic with these absolutely gorgeous covers by Xavier Colette. I really love looking at them. And at the start of each of these books, Pierre Fauvel starts out setting the scene of the world you are in. I've given you a translation on the right here, but I'm going to read the original French because, well, might as well, right? So it goes like this. Que voyons-nous? Nous reconnaissons d'abord un Paris pittoresque et vieillot, celui de la belle époque. Mais c'est aussi le Paris des premières automobiles, de l'art nouveau triomphant, de la fée électricité qui pointe le bout de son nez. Les messieurs ont de fières moustaches, des chapeaux melons, des canotiers. Les dames ont des corsets, des jupes et des jupons, des bottines à boutons. Voilà pour Paris, en 2 mots, tel qu'il fut. À présent, imaginez. So you might have heard the rhymes. It's a really like a poetic approach to language being done here. So this is like the historical, well, the version of historical Belle Époque Paris. And then after that, you have the anaphora of imagine, 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 where you have the historical lens, and over that he slides the fantastic lens, where the author invites you to imagine that the Eiffel Tower is made out of white magical wood, which sings on the stars and the moon, that there are little dragons flying around in the Luxembourg Gardens, that they are elegant fairies going to the opera. And because there's this connection between the city of Paris and the city kingdom of Ambremer, where all the fairies come from, and they're starting to merge together, basically. The thing is, even if you look at the original description of realistic Paris, is very much this notion of the Paris of our dreams, which is a notion used by scholar Ellen McCarthy to describe the depiction of Europe in a lot of anime, so Japanese animation depicting the 19th century. And there's definitely a lot of nostalgia involved. They're very fun, whimsical books. They feature, for example, flying cats, which have this ability, which can speak and are really, really old, named after battles, and have this ability to read books by taking naps on them, which is very much the dream. So it's very fun. It's also very white and male and cishet. And, you know, I love the covers, but I could do without the male gaze and being reminded every time of which female character is attractive and which one isn't. So, yeah. At any rate, the main character is called Louis Denisard Hippolyte Griffon. He's a magician, that's all you need to know. And like most magicians who get to live for a long time and have lots of money and nothing to do, he's bored. So at the beginning of each of the 3 books, you find him working on a little invention of his, which is his motorcycle, which he calls La Pétulante. This is a fart joke, basically. There's something very specific about this motorcycle, which is that it doesn't smell like gasoline or oil or anything. Instead, it smells like baked honey. And in the first book, there's a character who's just there to be told that information. We learn that it runs on a different source of energy than the one we're familiar with in the early 20th century. So this idea that certain trees in the magical kingdom of Ambremer have this ability of synthesizing and absorbing sunlight, I mean photosynthesis, but then kind of keeping the energy of it. And if you take the bioluminescent sap, which they produce, you can use this as, this is what he's discovered, a power source, which he calls la lumière étrange, strange light. And this has no bearing on the plot whatsoever. It's just something he does for fun. And in the 3rd book, he's very depressed because La Pétulante now runs perfectly and he has nothing else to do. He promptly manages to crash it, and then somebody gives him a car and he's like, oh, I could just do the same thing with the car. So then he's happy again. You know, men. Of course, the whole notion of finding a source of clean, sustainable energy is important to genres like Solarpunk, which I mentioned already, which is sort of an offshoot from steampunk, but also answering to cyberpunk. So there's many different ways in which new subgenres have developed since the 2009, 2010, basically. And it started out in Brazil for the first anthology. So Solarpunk is one particular example of a literary project being also intimately connected with real world political attitudes, trying to save the planet, which we would all like to do, obviously. So going back to the specific technology being invented by the main character in Jacques book. So of course, I think the association which is made is that the name of the kingdom, magical kingdom, is Ambremer. You might have heard the word ambre, which of course is amber, so which is a kind of sap or resin, which over time is turned into a semi-precious stones. And that's very much in keeping with the overall aesthetic of the books, which you've seen as represented by the gorgeous cover art. But, and here I have my last content warning for mass deaths and mutilation being mentioned in the code, although the image is not part of it. So, you know what else comes from trees is rubber. So Nissi Scholl's Everfair is very interesting in that it starts out with this very optimistic view. You get one of the main characters, Lisette, who is living in Burgundy at the time in 1899, who is just rolling down a hill on this new bicycle that she acquired, and is just enjoying the freedom, exhilarated, all of that. And you've got this, of course, this association between women riding bicycles and women's emancipation, wearing bloomers, all of that. So it's a very optimistic outlook. And then in the very next chapter, the first word is horror. And you get a character who is Reverend Thomas Jefferson Wilson, is part of the American missionaries, who is just coming back from a trip to the Congo Free State and has seen the horrors which are done there, and has seen what goes into the rubber that is used to produce the wheels of the very bicycle that Lisette was riding. And he ends up giving this talk to an audience to kind of motivate them to stop the horrors of the Congo Free State, with a little bit of show and tell, showing them the ball of raw rubber, which he says is a substance bidding fair to replace ivory as the Dark Continent's most profitable export, and comparing that to the weight of a imaginary basket filled with the severed hands of the workers who have not met their daily quota and are being horribly abused by the overseers. And then King Mwenda, who is one of the point of views we get in the book, has his own way of describing rubber. He calls them the tears of the wines who weep. The way it looks when you extract them from the trees, which is a very evocative way of alluding to the pain that goes into getting this valuable resource, because there's always a price to be paid for power. And in books like Pierre Pével's, this price is just invisible because we're not dealing with the ones who are paying it, basically. Okay, so end of content warning. We're good. So as male-gazy as Kida's design in Atlantis was, there is also a very honest element to having the princess, love interest, becoming literally one with the magical power source whom the imperialists would like to steal and bring back for themselves. Is this image, of course, of the colonized body, and especially female bodies, being an object of desire and a resource who people like to take and do with it as they want. So like it's very, there's layers to this cartoon, which is very lovely in many ways and problematic in others. So here's the thing with steampunk, is that one of the reasons that the Difference Engine is so famous is that it is very, very much metafictional historiography and kind of plays with history and rewriting things, sort of rewriting of Sybil by Disraeli, all of that. However, if you go by the analysis of Jay Clayton in Hacking the 19th Century, which is a very good chapter, in his opinion, the novel ends up affirming the alliance between technology and traditional Victorian assumptions about female sexuality, empire, and the police that its irreverence about other historical pieties would seem to reject. So, like, it's in the name. It's called the Difference Engine. So you kind of have to ask, okay, but what kind of difference does it make? Because, of course, you can have fun with history, but again, maybe you would like to go a little bit beyond that. And some examples which we have of difference engines which actually make a difference is, of course, the Effluent Engine, this invented by Jemisin, where it's not about erasing the horrors of slavery, but sublimating it in a way. So Giseline talks about the fact that Haitian sugar is no less sweet for its coating of blood, metaphorical blood, again, being a desired resource. And then the whole plot, like the whole idea of the Effluent Engine, is about using methane gas created during the fermentation, which is waste, which is stinky, which is noxious, which is polluting, using it as a source of energy to ensure their freedom. And the first line of the short story is New Orleans stank to the heavens. So you've got like conflation of the stink of methane gas and the stink of just a city with lots of people. But of course, New Orleans also stinks in a metaphorical way through the presence of racism and colorism, which is a society that Eugenie has grown up in. And then Everfair. So I said that Tink developed atomic energy, but really I had to look at an article to find out that it was atomic energy, because it looks very much like magic, the way that the air canoes are being powered in the book. And the way it's actually described, it's in the quote at the bottom. On the platform projecting from the stern, Lily slid away the barrier between the two elves powering Mbusa's littlest heater, allowing them to interact. Soon the pressure grew high enough. She engaged the propeller and they darted forward. And if you're going to describe technology, of course, within Everfair, it has to be about the land. It has to be about the earth. It has to be about trying to mix two things together to create something new, to create something that propels the plot and the world building forward. And it's an alliance which is sort of doomed to fail within the book, because like, even though the white Everfairians try to understand, they don't in many ways, and King Wenda ends up having to once again yeet them out of this new country. And of course, Everfair is a utopia which is doomed to fail, because the inhabitants refuse to be on the same side as Belgium in the First World War. So they do not come out on the side of the winners. So it's a political utopia which fails, but it's still a story which succeeds in personal ways, mainly through the love story of Lisette and Daisy, who after 40 years of disagreement and one annoying husband who keeps not being dead, they finally get together and have the happily ever after at the end of the story. So this is the thing we get at the end. And talking about the future of steampunk. So as was already pointed out, including by Rachel Cochran, steampunk is counterintuitively largely an American movement. Large-scale steampunk conventions are mostly based in America, etc. The relative reluctance of 21st century British men and women to reenact their nation's violent colonizing past is understandable, but it calls into question American steampunk's enthusiasm for affecting often stereotypically British personas, histories, and ritual. And Diana Foe mentions on one of her posts on Beyond Victoriana, which again, as Julia said, is an invaluable resource, how difficult she found it to create her own persona, they call them steamstona in steampunk circles, within this very white subculture she found herself in. She talks about, again, the inherent nostalgia that exists within steampunk, saying Americans can at least reestablish that lost long connection to Mother England by recreating the former colonial connection, and maybe by some sort of historical/cultural osmosis, we can regain that Victorian elegance we had begun to lose when we did that silly thing with the tea and the protest and such. So in 2018, I gave a talk, which then became an article on post-colonial steampunk, and I decided, because I'd realized pretty late, I am sometimes very slow, that all the authors in my PhD were white. So I was like, okay, well, this time I'm going to take only authors of color to write about post-colonial steampunk because that would make sense, right? And it's only towards the end of doing the presentation and the article that I realized that they were all authors of color. Most of them were American still, from different origins, different diasporas, but still, only examples who were not were Shweta Narayan and also Olivier Ho, whose picture I could not find, so which is why I have the little icon here. And of course, this makes sense because the center of speculative fiction publishing is still in the US, especially New York. And it kind of calls into question for me the future of steampunk and the way it develops. Because so there's this notion in the theory of possible words by Marie-Laure, which is the principle of minimal departure. It's this idea that when you're reading a book, you start out assuming that the world in which the book is set is the same as the world you know. And then the more you learn about it, the more you try to amend it. But you're never going to assume out of the gate that the world is completely different, because that's not an economical way of dealing with information, basically. So you expand your worldview as you read, building up what Richard Saint-Gelais refers to as a xeno-encyclopedia, building up of Umberto Eco's concept of the encyclopedia, which is the sum total of the things which you know about the world, and which changes depending on what era you live in, what country, etc. So as you're reading speculative fiction and steampunk in particular, you build up a certain ease with deducing what kind of xeno-encyclopedia we're dealing with, where it diverges, where the departure is minimal, and where it is maximal. When I first read The Strange Affair of Springfield Jack, I don't think I knew exactly who Springfield Jack was, but I knew he was a Victorian thing. And I could tell certain points where the author was playing with history, including the more obvious one, which is, what the hell is a Victorian? Where I just sprang right out of my seat and went, what? What's going on? Because of course, Victoria is like the biggest signpost for steampunk, because she is like, she's usually there in the steampunk set in the 19th century in England. And compared to that, reading the Padisha Begum's reflection, I had no idea who Janara was. I'd sort of heard about the story of the Taj Mahal, but this was not part of my repertoire. And of course, that's on me. It's also a little bit on the school and university system, but that's another topic. So as a steampunk scholar, you learn to recognize certain signposts, and you build up again this store of knowledge of how history can be messed with in interesting ways. But honestly, first reading the Padisha Begum's reflection, I was completely disoriented. So by now, I've been able to kind of puzzle out where things are set, sort of, like knowing what the Red Forge was in Agra, and that Agra is, or Akbaratad in the story, being able to tell what the two different time notations refer to, all of that. And understanding how it kind of all fit together. And honestly, the story was first referred to me by Jamie Go when I was looking for Indian steampunk that was own voices as much as possible. And I had the anthology Lesbian Steampunk Stories, but I hadn't read all of them because I could not recognize it as Indian steampunk, because my mind went British Raj. And of course, it's completely silly. Why would post-colonial steampunk set itself within the British? But there was a lot to deconstruct for me. And it took me a long time to realize that this story is not for me. It was not written for me. I can still read it, and it's on me to do the work to understand it. But it was not written for me as a white scholar coming from a colonizing force. And there's a very good author spotlight with Shweta Narayan, where they talk about the work they did on the story, and specifically the choice of using the two different formats for the dates, which I am pathetically grateful, because I already am really bad with geography, like in general, even in Europe, so I would have been completely lost, and time is also complicated. But yeah, so like if you push this reflection towards the extreme, decolonial steampunk, so building on the works developed by scholars like Walter Mignolo, Aníbal Quijano, Maria Lugones, if we go towards this idea of an epistemic decolonization, logically, decolonial steampunk would become unreadable, at least to white readers, as steampunk, because you would have to completely deconstruct the signposts which we white scholars rely upon to understand what is modern, what is contemporary, when certain eras start and stop, what certain events are, and all the layers that come into it. Like Filipino steampunk is already really complicated because of the different layers of colonization, and the sort of like symptom of it. So I have no specific point about it. It's just a reflection I'm having about what kind of future is possible within the development of post-colonial and decolonial steampunk. And honestly, when I first presented that paper on post-colonial steampunk, I thought it would be the future of the genre. But 2 years later, there's still not that many full-length novels which would fit that definition. And I kind of wonder about the evolution of the genre and what it will bring, and if it will continue to kind of develop and become more diverse, or whether the more popular books will still be within that familiar context which people recognize, like 1870s London. So to conclude, this is my third time presenting on steampunk, and I seem to always end up with hope punk as my final answer. I don't know why exactly. In case you don't know, this is a term which was coined by Alex Rowland in 2018 as being sort of the opposite both of grimdark and of noble bright. So I'm somebody who loves taxonomies, and even I have to acknowledge that all the taxonomies that you find within the subgenres of steampunk are kind of ridiculous after a certain point. So this is from the Steampunk Bible, showing you the different boilerpunk and clubpunk and dieselpunk and gaslight romance, manor punk and Rhaegar Gothic and stitchpunk. So those really don't serve a marketing function, I think, and they're also not very useful as kind of scholarly taxonomies, but they show this desire of individual authors and also different countries at making steampunk their own and twisting it in ways which are interesting to them. So some people really like Nikolai Tesla. Well, you know, to each their own. Solar punk does very specific things. It has specific preoccupations. FFair has been described by Docell Young as cotton gin punk. You have notion of sill punk, which was coined by Ken Liu. Goth punk, called by James Lovegrove, but also used by other authors afterwards. So again, it's about putting whatever you want in the empty teacup, which is the steampunk aesthetic. And maybe what I really need in my teacup is hope, apparently. So I'm just going to read you the definition because I kind of like it. So hope punk isn't pristine and spotless. Hope punk is grubby because that's what happens when you fight. It's hard, it's filthy, sweaty, backbreaking work that never ends. It isn't pretty, and it isn't noble, and it isn't nice. Though I expect natural inclination, and even my own instinctive inclination, is to make it so, to forget the word radical in the phrase radical kindness, to forget the punk part of hope punk, which is really the operative half of the word. There are no heroes and no villains, they are just people. That's hope punk. Whether the glass is half full or half empty, what matters is that there's water in that glass, and that's something worth defending. So there's this whole thing within steampunk scholarship in trying to distinguish the good from the bad steampunk, the one which is just nostalgic versus the one which actually tries to do something. So Cory Goss in the first issue of Steampunk magazine talked about nostalgic versus melancholic steampunk, which is the proper one. So it's a gatekeeping way of phrasing it. And my Persian uses the notions of nostalgia and regret borrowed from Rod Latham to talk about, again, nostalgic steampunk as being the bad thing, and then regret being a way showing that there's an opportunity to rewrite the past, not the naive hope that it can be changed, but rather that terrestrial futurist speculations can affect the present and the future. And if you look at, again, Everfair, I feel like regret is definitely one main emotion which we find in that. So this is again from Anisi Shaw's historical note. I like to think that with a nudge or two, events might have played out much more happily for the inhabitants of equatorial Africa. They might have enjoyed a prosperous future filled with all the technology that delights current steampunk fans in stories of Western Europe and North America, and more. In Everfair, they do. Of course, steampunk is a form of fiction, a fantasy, and the events within these pages never happened. But they could have. So there's a world of regret within this might and this could, but there's also joy and there's also hope. So like this is one phase of hope punk. If it is a term you like there's lots of people who have like issue with it, especially since Alex Rowland is a non-binary author, but they are still white. So specific view on hope, which is really not my lane to say, obviously. So you've got this kind of hope punk, which shows you the hard lessons to be learned and the things which are lost. Then you also have hope punk, like the one written by, again, Fenderson J. Clark. So The Hunting of Tramcar 15, which is set in the same world as the Edgy in Cairo. And again, colonizers have been yeeted, but there's still problems because sometimes you have a tram and it becomes haunted. And you discover that the bureaucrat who is trying to hire to kind of get money from the paranormal investigators is the one responsible for the hunting because he is trafficking Armenian candy, and this creates a host of problems. And they are Egyptian suffragettes, and they are gender fluid jinn, and all sorts of crazy hijinks, including creepy dolls in the story. And it's very much like, it's very hopeful, it's very joyful, it's a very whimsical one, but there's still very much the post-colonial work being done in the background of it. So again, I no longer know whether post-colonial steampunk is the direction in which the genre will develop. Doesn't mean that post-colonial scholars will stop doing good work. They're definitely doing it. So Jamie Go, who you can support on Ko-fi, and who has this list of primary works with authors written by authors of color and centering characters of color, which is very much a must if you want to start reading this kind of fiction. And people again like Diana Foe here in her persona as Eileen the Peacemaker, showing the ability to create hybrid new identities out of the diaspora and dealing with the inherent nostalgia of steampunk in different ways. And at the end of his steampunk FAQ, Dr. Persian says, maybe steampunk did die once or twice. You might argue that it died sometimes in the 90s and was brought back to life as a steam-powered spider automaton when Wild Wild West was released. But I'd say that it dies and is reborn each time one steampunk artist finishes their work with it and a new one takes it up, which I think is a nice idea, and it's definitely very gothic. So one of those genres which has been declared dead regularly since pretty much when it started. And you know, if we're looking at what steampunk has become, I feel like a giant mechanical spider just trying to blow everything up for a mad scientist. Not necessarily the best image. Like again, Howl's Moving Castle, which is just this ramshackle collection of things in clouds of steam, just held together with hopes and dreams, and also a falling star, is also a very nice image of steampunk, which is, it's kind of weird. It's not very practical. It's still noodling along and we still like it, and it will probably keep on surviving and just belching clouds of steam at us. And since the theme of this week was actually vampires, before I jumped in, I'll give you as a bonus some steampunk vampires in 3 different flavors. So you have your murdery, horrible flavor for Anna Dracula. You have your fabulous and gay flavor in Solas. The love interests are all werewolves, what can I say? And then you have the angsty and heroic, more Twilight flavor in Vampire Empire. So this is what you can have if you would like your vampires to be steampunk flavored. And with that, this is now the end of the journey, which took a little bit longer than 28 seconds. be quite honest.
Yay, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, of course, everybody, any questions, any comments, do feel free. I think there's some comments just at the bottom there from Tanagra. Lots of comments.
One reason I don't do steampunk anymore is the whiteness and romanticizing of colonialism in books and events. This made me want to reconsider it, focusing on people of color. Okay, I'm glad, because there's good books out there. But yeah, it's still like... And also there's books I love, but not when I'm looking at them through the post-colonial lens. Sure.
I'm just clicking that link while it's up there.
Yeah, I think I put it in the slide somewhere, but yeah, it was republished by Fantasy Magazine, so you can all read it. And the Effluent Engine was also republished, so you don't have to buy the anthology. You could if you want lesbians, but you know, you don't have to.
No, Caro, we can't click on the stuff in your presentation because it's a screen share.
No, I know. I just mean that once you get the slides, the link is also in there. I know how technology works, kind of.
A little aside, would you rec Anno Dracula? Since you brought it up in the slides.
Yes, I would. It's been a long time since I read it. I remember writing not entirely complimentary things with dealing with imperialism in my PhD. It's general problems with depicting Jack the Ripper stories in neo-Victorian stories and steampunk, and showing this sort of heroic depiction of him, which is always kind of it's really a pitfall that I don't think authors want to get into, but then they still fall into it. And oh yeah, I remember specifically I was bothered by this image of Victoria as this victim of imperialism as embodied by Dracula, which again, if you look at the history of the British Empire, it's very much like, oh no, it's not her fault, it's the evil vampires. And if you go by the Dracula reading of Dracula being this sort of Eastern threat coming to the West. So there's different ways of looking at it. It is extremely meta. You definitely get this steampunk tendency of having both the characters and the authors appearing in the same world. It's very much a who's who steampunk style of like recognizing illusions and things and different kind of vampires and having adventures and all of that. So it's a cool book. It doesn't hold up to all of the lenses, which is one way of looking at it. Gender, also not great from what I remember, my feelings reading it.
I feel like it's going down from yes to no, maybe not.
Well, again, it all depends on what you're looking for. Somebody asked me this morning if I would rec The Strange Affair of Springfield Jack, and also it's a very good book. Lots of content warnings, but it's very cool. But again, you can tell it was written by a white cis-het man. I do not love the portrayal of female characters. It's not queer enough, but then so are most books are not queer enough. That's a general problem we have. So it depends what you're looking for, really.
True. Yeah. If nobody has any major questions, I'll turn the recording off. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Karen.